Good evening. I'm Wendy Black, Chair of the WRJ Pacific District Program Committee. And on behalf of our committee, thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Empty Bowls, Hungry Children. We're honored to welcome representatives of MAZON the Jewish Response to Hunger. Neither college nor a decent job can assure there will be enough money for food. Illness or a severe business reversal can wipe it out. Often the parents and children are so embarrassed that they hide the reality. The parents are embarrassed they can't provide enough for their families, and the kids usually don't want to say anything because they're just kids and want to be like their friends. Tonight, our speakers will explain the profound effects of food insecurity on children and how we can be of help. We're joined by Marla Feldman, MAZON's Director of Programs, the department that oversees grants to organizations around the country. She also is a former member of the Peace Corps and the manager of small business development programs within the African Development Foundation. An expert in food banks, Marla also has spearheaded national initiatives such as Healthy Options, Healthy Meals, which encourages the food banks to distribute healthier foods. Liz Braun-Lilenfeld is MAZON's Deputy Director of Community Engagement. As she seeks opportunities for MAZON to interact with groups around the country, she'll address how your sisterhood or synagogue can help fight hunger in your communities. Liz has organizational experience with the Jewish and social justice worlds, including working for Jewish World Watch, a nonprofit Jewish advocacy group that fights hunger and mass atrocities and their far-reaching effects, including hunger. First, I'd like to welcome Liz Braun-Lilenfeld.
Was I muted? I'm so sorry.
You were muted.
I was muted. I kept talking. Okay. Well, thank you, Wendy. I'm so pleased that you invited us to speak here today, and thank you so much for that introduction. We are grateful, and we're also grateful to the WRJ for giving us this platform. So as Wendy shared, I'm Liz Braun-Lilenfeld, and I work in the engagement department at MAZON. I'll cede the floor soon to my colleague. She's had a long career at MAZON and is our staff expert on nutrition. And so she'll kind of carry the meat of our topic here today. But I wanted to start us off with a bit of framing about MAZON and why we do the work that we do. So MAZON was founded 36 years ago. We work to end hunger for people of all faiths and backgrounds in the US and Israel. And we do this through three pillars of work: education, advocacy, and capacity building. So education is the kind of work we're doing with you today. We undertook some theory of change work, examining how we get to the change we wish to see in the world. And in that mapping exercise, we surfaced this connection between policy change and stigma. Addressing the stigma, that is the stigma towards benefits programs and the people that use them, moves us towards policy change. And policy change in turn reduces stigma. That's the engine that drives our education and engagement work. We saw the marriage equality movement use this tactic really effectively. Increasing representation of the LGBTQ community and queer relationships in media helped move us towards marriage equality, kind of a changing hearts and minds approach. We work to do the same thing in the hunger space, recognizing that all people deserve to feed themselves with dignity, regardless of circumstance, moves us towards establishing the policies that will make that true. We'll talk later about how we engage with communities to push that work forward, because I personally would love to work with all of you. So next, we focus on advocacy because we see that as the engine of systemic change. As a community, we often focus on what we call direct service, contributing to food banks and meal programs. And these are, of course, incredibly important ways to interact with our community. They serve an important emergency need. And like Wendy was sharing, if someone lost their job or is missing out on hours because they're sick or have a person they need to care for, they may suddenly find themselves unable to adequately meet their food needs. Some 40% of Americans can't pay a $400 emergency expense. So they need support now. They can't wait to navigate the bureaucracy of a benefits program. However, and I want to stress this because it's wild, 95% of food assistance is provided by government programs. 95%. Our emergency food systems, so all the food banks, all the meal programs, that services that other 5%, they were already incredibly overstretched. And suddenly it became headline news at the beginning of the pandemic when folks were lining up for hours at food banks to try and meet their needs. And this reliance on food banks is a disservice to those organizations and to the people that are in need of support. They need sustainable solutions. And those solutions are well-funded, dynamic, accessible government programs, because the government is the only entity with the reach and the leverage to match the scale of this problem. And it's our advocacy that holds our representatives accountable to making them so. And so finally, capacity building. We work with partner organizations in the anti-hunger space to build their ability to do advocacy work locally. This program has evolved to be more targeted and more strategic over the years. We specifically look to states with weaker advocacy infrastructures and social safety nets. So for example, with our support, we helped an organization hire 2 people to do exclusively state-based anti-hunger advocacy work in Mississippi. The only two people in the state who are doing that work. An investment of $110,000. And they engineered a policy that passed that year that helped 90,000 people access SNAP. We couldn't have purchased a single meal for all of those folks with those funds. So to bring it back, we undertake this work as a Jewish organization. And what does it mean to us, to our people, to undertake anti-hunger work? And more pertinently, what does it mean to you to do the work of social justice as a Jew or because of your Judaism? And I hope we'll get there in our discussion. But I had wanted to do a brief Devar Torah with you, but the parasha feels so on the nose, or maybe it just is to me because, you know, when you do this work, you read every parasha under one lens. But so we're reading about the plagues of Egypt and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and the plagues that culminate with that, which singles out children, give or take. This reads to me so clearly as a reflection of the terrible things that threaten our nation and that our leadership and our communities can become numb to, where the sweeping policy choices that could change the tide are too often not made. We have such a powerful model of an advocate in Moses, and an equally powerful, if upsetting, picture of a decision maker in Pharaoh whose stance is so unmoved by the cause of justice. And just as we read this every year, and just as Moses continued to stand before Pharaoh, we must continue the work. And we have other texts we could explore. A favorite we turn to from Vayikra is, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the edges of your fields or gather the gleanings of your harvest, leave it for the poor and the stranger. Or tradition, you know, our Jewish identities that are so tied to food traditions, and how the work of ensuring people can eat with dignity is so much more than calories into bodies. But I'll leave that to the Q&A if that's something we want to explore further. So for now, I'd love to turn things over to my colleague Marla so we can dive into how hunger affects children. This is another facet of our work, examining hunger through the lens of different populations and addressing their unique barriers to food security. So Marla, I'll leave it to you.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Wendy, for the lovely introductions. And thank you to all of you for the opportunity to join you this evening to discuss the psychological effects of hunger on children. When we think of children growing up in a food insecure household, one of the first things that come to mind is the psychological toll this must take on a young child. children from vulnerable, low-income families often feel stigmatized in different ways, from the most basic standpoint of not having what other kids have, to standing in line at a food pantry, or being singled out for being the kid that gets the free or reduced price school meals, to an even more pernicious issue that often follows children straight into adulthood that I've done a lot of work around, which is becoming overweight or obese due to poor nutrition, and even developing chronic diet-related conditions such as type 2 diabetes or hypertension at a young age, which carries a whole bunch of stigmas with that. And as you can imagine, stretching one's limited budget often equates to a diet of cheap, nutrient-poor meals to feed one's family. And our Jewish values compel us to make the world a better place, to pursue justice, and to treat everyone with dignity and respect. MAZON believes that everyone has a right to nutritious, culturally appropriate, affordable food. And that's what we do every day. We work diligently to raise awareness of all these issues, to shift the narrative, and to seek policies that address the stigma and inequities faced by those seeking nutrition assistance. So there's a few areas. I mean, we do, as Liz said, work in a number of areas in outreach, education, and advocacy. But there's a few areas of MAZON's work that I think resonate to the topic of this evening's discussion about the psychological effects of hunger on children that I'd like to discuss. The first one is around universal school meals, which is more recently referred to as healthy school meals for all. So, I mean, we all know children can't learn when they're hungry, especially at the beginning of the school day. Yet so many families are cut off from accessing a critical source of nutrition for their children, which is school meals, and that's school breakfast and school lunch. And MAZON's been advocating to reduce barriers to accessing school meals for over a decade. Back in 2012, we launched the first successful campaign to expose the fact that students were shamed and stigmatized if they were unable to pay for their lunch, a practice that became known as lunch shaming. And in states around the country, we actually had staff that went around the country to witness this. We witnessed schools denying children food in pretty cruel and stigmatizing ways. I mean, it's really hard to wrap your head around this, but it's true. If a child went to pay for their hot lunch and there was a balance due, like they had $10 or $200 due, oftentimes their lunch would be tossed in the garbage right in front of their peers. And they would in turn be given a paper sack with a cold cheese sandwich or a cheese stick. I mean, children do not want to be labeled the poor kid by their peers. And hence their families are often hesitant to face the negative stereotypes and assumptions that accompany accessing these vital nutrition assistance programs like the National School Lunch Program. And we've been talking about this for years. No child should ever be punished, stigmatized, or shamed because of an inability to pay for their lunch. Yet lunch shaming persists because of draconian local policies, outdated income guidelines for the National School Lunch Program, and a lack of political will. Fortunately, MAZON's successful campaign led to the passage of the No Shame at School Act in Minnesota back in 2014, which banned the practice of lunch shaming. And since then, over 15 states have either passed or proposed similar legislation nationwide, and several bills have been introduced at the federal level as well. But as you can see, the biggest barriers to kids getting school meals are cost and stigma. So universal school meals, which was put in practice during COVID, gets rid of the cost. And when every kid is getting it, that gets rid of the stigma. So Often in the vanguard, California was the first state in the country to pass legislation making school meals free to all students, followed only by Maine this past summer, June and July 21. And exciting news to share, just yesterday, we got to watch a hearing in the Massachusetts Joint Committee on Education as they considered a similar bill that would permanently establish free school breakfast and lunch for all students. We're proud about this campaign because we want to share that MAZON's organizer, Lauren Bannister, has been working with the Jewish and anti-hunger communities on this campaign in Massachusetts for several months. And she set out and gathered a lot of testimony from congregants and others to share the voices of parents, teachers, students. She had faith leaders and some other community members in preparation for yesterday's hearing. So I sat there watching with a big smile because it was so rewarding to hear the testimony during the hearing, and really powerful testimony. There was a teenage boy who shared a difficult story, his own journey growing up with his mom, a single mom, and what it feels like to him today, even to not have the money to cover the cost of school lunch. It's very moving. So they will be voting on this bill in the coming months, and we can certainly keep you posted as to the outcome. But I believe strongly that we're going to be seeing more states push for universal school meals or healthy school meals for all, even this coming year. I strongly believe, because it just makes sense. And when everybody's accessing the meals free, there's just no stigma attached. So that is one area that we feel really strongly about that would greatly help the nutritional needs of children. Another area that MAZON has worked on for over 15 years is around nutrition and the link between hunger and health, both in our federal nutrition programs, such as SNAP, which otherwise known as food stamps, and with school meals, as we just discussed, and also with the charitable food system. It was interesting that, Liz, you were using the term emergency food system, because I've been with MAZON, last year was my 20th year with MAZON, and I remember when I called it the emergency food system over the years, when we realized that it was no longer for emergency needs, that so many families were relying regularly on this system for their nutritional needs just to get through the month. If they were accessing SNAP, that might help them for 1 to 2 weeks, and their own limited budget might last another week. But the charitable food system, going to the food pantry in so many families, is crucial to get through that last week of the month. So we've started calling it as well the charitable food system. So that's what I'm referring to, food pantries and food banks. So MAZON launched its first effort around nutrition and healthy eating, which I was leading all of this work. That was back in 2007. And that was in California, as I said, and it was really just to explore how the anti-hunger community and food banks can become leaders around this issue. And that gained a lot of attention, and was then we moved to lead a national initiative in 2010, as Wendy mentioned, called Healthy Options, Healthy Meals. And that was supported by Kaiser Permanente, who was very interested in this work. And MAZON spent the next 5 years working closely with food banks across the country to prioritize health and wellness and to bring more nutritious food to food banks and food pantries. And it was a very successful program. Much of this work was centered around, without getting too much in the weeds, like developing formal written nutrition policies and implementing inventory tracking systems that helped assess the nutritional quality of the food they were acquiring and distributing. And we had strong interest, not just in the healthy food that food banks were distributing, but also in the percentage of unhealthy food that was moving through the system. And there's just been some great progress since then. As a result of these efforts, this issue was elevated to the national level, and we watched huge momentum in the field over the last 10 years as food banks and pantries really across the country have made great strides to increase the distribution of fresh produce, lean proteins, whole grains, and other nutritious foods, and also push to boost the nutrition education efforts as well, because the education is really important. It's one thing to have access to more nutritious foods and produce, and it's another thing to have the education to realize how important it is to be preparing nutritious meals and really using all the foods that you're getting at the food pantry. And this work went on for many years and culminated a few years ago in a research study and a report that we published called A Tipping Point. And we're really proud of the fact that this report was extremely influential in the past couple of years, even during COVID, in the field, and led to several other national efforts that we were brought on as advisors. Such one of them, and several of these were funded through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And one of them was the development of new national food bank nutrition guidelines that have since in the last year been adopted by Feeding America and are now available to food banks nationwide. So we're really proud of that. Even other stakeholders in the system, such as the large corporate food donors who, which comprise the unhealthy food in the charitable food system. I mean, the food banks aren't purchasing these things, they're mostly donated. And I don't mean donated from the food drives, at a synagogue in your barrels, one-offs. I'm talking large pallets of large donations. And I think that we're really starting to see that the needle is moving on that front as well, because there has since been some other initiatives since A Tipping Point specifically talking about the donation stream. And I've even seen some large corporate food donors starting to really look at nutritional guidelines and wanting their donations to be healthier. So that's a slower train of progress, but it's moving. It has begun. And as we continue to weigh in and support improvements as well, we continue to weigh in on federal policies and safety net programs. There's been a lot of innovative interventions and new programs that have taken place. And we do support and send in letters and weigh in when we can. Some of these are things like revised nutrition standards at school, for school meals and summer meals, for child and adult care programs. There's been great progress years ago in the WIC food package. And even with SNAP, which in California, we call CalFresh, there's the SNAP incentive programs, some of you may have seen, to increase consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables. Some call it double up bucks, where a family can go to a farmer's market, what have you, and get twice as much of their, they get double their dollars if they use it to buy fresh produce. There's also been food insecurity screening questions that have been added by hospitals and health clinics that they ask every patient, and then patients are referred to public benefit programs, to food pantries, and also to something that's new the last few years called prescriptions for fresh fruits and vegetables, where doctors are literally giving out produce prescriptions. So there's lots of great work taking place. I just wanted to speak about a couple that we were really involved with, because even as Liz said, the emergency food system, the charitable food system, is only 5% of the nutrition assistance that's taking place. There's still thousands and thousands of families across the country that rely on that system. And when they go to a food pantry, they're not just getting a box or bag of food. It's a trusted environment. I've been to so many, and they're getting the nutrition education. We're hoping that has an impact in their own personal lifestyle, and that the dietary behavior changes are taking place when they use their own SNAP dollars. And just as we all, try to make healthier changes in our lives, a lot of that education and trust is, takes place at the food pantry. So it is, I don't ever want to diminish the importance of that. But I just feel like can't speak about this issue without talking about what's now almost a couple of years. As we all know, and it was mentioned earlier, I think by Liz, that, COVID laid bare the fact that more Americans than we'd like to believe go hungry each day. And we all watched, like Liz said, the miles long lines at the food pantries on our television screens as the rates of food insecurity skyrocketed, especially at the start of the pandemic. I recall by December 2020, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, the rate of food insecurity had doubled from 42 million to over 80 million. And while those numbers have come down since then to where they pretty much where they were at the onset, it was already way too high, before the pandemic. 40 million food insecure Americans is way too many. So it's really only thanks to the great advocacy by community members like you and local, state, and national organizations like MAZON that Congress approved federal funding to shore up the safety net. And, COVID also brought a heightened awareness of the inequities in our food system and which populations are disproportionately impacted by hunger and obesity and chronic diet-related illnesses, as was evident, we all saw, by the rates of hospitalizations and deaths among particularly Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So I would say that it's long overdue that I feel like I know MAZON, but I don't know any organization right now that is not approaching their work through an equity lens, equity in all policies and in all programs. That's the goal. And I, and think that's, like I said, long overdue, but I think only by addressing the inequities can we really start to make some serious systemic changes. So the topics that I discussed are just some of the ways that children are impacted psychologically by growing up food insecure. And I know there are other ways as well. So I look forward to a rich discussion and welcome any questions you may have. So I thought from there we can just launch to a Q&A and a discussion.
Can you explain, both of you, because this can be really disheartening to listen to, although I do understand that the government has extended free lunches and breakfasts through the year, the school year. What we can do in our congregations or with our sisterhoods to help the problem in very real terms with the members of our communities, the children and the families of our communities who are lacking food.
Well, if you're in California, I'm sorry, I can't recall. I know many of you are in California and many of you are in some other states. So in California, like I said, we are now fortunate that school meals are free for all students, as is Maine, and fingers crossed, as will be in Massachusetts very soon, and that will be the third state. So one thing we could do is advocate for the same legislation that would provide free school meals for all. And because there's been so many, like I said, we've watched California and Maine with great success, and Massachusetts, hopefully. There's a lot of, already well-researched and prepared kind of documents and stuff that can be shared to help push a campaign like that. Like we said, MAZON's organizer, Lauren, could also provide some help because she's working with the anti-hunger groups and the synagogues in Massachusetts for this very goal.
Is the best thing, is the best thing at this point to just give to food banks, or to let, to give to funds in our own congregations? I mean, do people generally come forward, or are they really too embarrassed to go to clergy and say they need help?
I mean, I would say there's lots of layers to it, right? And it's a both and. You know, if you're and I mean, if you're talking about potential hunger in your community, like in your synagogue community, and we shouldn't discount that. You know, too often we assume that our neighbors, that our friends are food secure, and that might not be the case for a whole number of reasons. And so certainly there's discussions you can have, like at your synagogue leadership level, for ways to you know, introduce those kind of vetting questions into those relationships. You know, if it's with your educators, if it's with your clergy, you know, to make sure that your membership are having their needs met. So that's one thing that can certainly be introduced. You know, and I can't speak with any authority about the kind of direct service approaches. You know, certainly if your respective synagogues have kind of outreach programs, if you have pantries, then I'm sure there are all sorts of ways that you can be in touch with the kind of neighbors that are relying on those resources to see how to meet their needs. You know, for something with the pandemic, and, you know, goodness knows everything's changing all the time. One of the challenges that we faced with school meals was, how were kids going to get school meals if they weren't in school? And so I lived next to a high school for prior to my moving to my current home, and it was a distribution site, and so they were able to kind of change their model so that families could come through and pick up a bag with what would have been their school meals, and I think other kinds of resources. But depending on where you live, and depending on what each individual family is doing, they may not have been able to make that change to you know, come and pick those things up, instead of, you know, relying on the bus system or whatever it may be. And so maybe it's getting in touch with your local school and forming a relationship there, and seeing what needs aren't being met. You know, are there kids who you know, maybe they're in a rural neighborhood and it's too far for them to go pick up those resources without the bus, or maybe the jobs that their caretakers are in don't allow them to do that. And so what are the other ways that they can kind of benefit from that distribution? And so maybe there's a role for the community there. And so, you know, so much of this happens in relationship. Like, we don't know what the problems are unless we're talking to our community. And so for MAZON, you know, our solutions are very advocacy based, and I'd love to talk to any of you that were interested about how you can start having those conversations. You know, I think it could start with like education of your community, and you know, bringing. Sorry, it looks like Jill, like it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Apparently, I'm the only East Coaster.
Oh, hi.
Okay, so I'm in New York. I'm in a unique area called Rockland County. Our school system, public school, has about 9,000 children. Our Haredi and Orthodox has 27,000. Our temple, which is Reformed, supports the Rhoda Bloom Food Pantry, which is the Orthodox kosher pantry, and People to People, which services, quote unquote, the rest of the communities. I'm curious, excuse me, within your advocacy, etc., in California and Maine, are they targeted for public school? Or when you say universal, does it include all the private schools?
That we're talking about the public school system. Yes, specifically public school.
Okay, and we have a cross problem because we have universal busing, we have universal library, we have universal this, that, and the other thing. I don't know if we have universal food access. Obviously, it's not the same delivery system from the kosher to the non-kosher,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm, you know, we support MAZON individually and whatever. But I was curious to find out what's doing because, as I say, we are revoltingly unique, and it's getting worse.
So,
And
it's interesting, Jill. I don't have the details, but I actually, and Marla, you can fill in if this is something you're familiar with, but I know there was a movement to get the needs of private schools and Orthodox yeshivas filled. And I think it was under some measure of pandemic legislation. Like they were talking, and there was some campaign to extend it. Like that there, the idea was that there was kind of a donut hole that's, with some kids going, this is where I'm going to lose the thread. I'm forgetting the details. But I think there was some coverage for other kinds of students. And so, and that's kind of the way advocacy can evolve. If we're looking at how to address the needs of public school students, and like that's, it's already a set system, like the school meals exist, and to kind of change the funding is kind of one tool, and then to extend it to other schools and other students in need, that could be, it would probably require a different model, but it doesn't mean it's not something that can't be pursued.
But I think you raise a good point, at both of you, which is this pandemic support has an end date and is finite, and that's what we all need to realize. Just like the expanded unemployment benefits, the assistance the schools are getting, families are getting, it's going to end. And that's why I think it's really important that we're having this discussion and you're thinking kind of outside the box of what can we do. And I only brought up the advocacy around the universal school meals because oftentimes that breakfast and the lunch particularly is for many children the most nutritious meal they're going to have that day. So it is a critical source of nutrition for children and for their families. And that's why, because I see the momentum growing now with Massachusetts and other states, I'm sure who are starting advocacy around this, or even further along, that was an opportunity for the states that don't have it, which are many, since there's still only 2. But like Liz said, there really are a number of ways to get engaged. That's kind of a bigger, tall order. But there are kind of more local needs that can be met as well, like Liz was saying.
Looks like I saw Cher and Julia. Maybe Cher first. And then...
Thank you. So MAZON is a Jewish organization, and I heard you say earlier that you have large corporations donating to MAZON. I'm wondering how they feel about making donations, since it is a religious organization, how they view that.
I'm sorry, I have to clarify because I didn't mean to say that. MAZON doesn't get any donations of food, etc. I was talking more about, to clarify, in the charitable food system, the emergency food system, that food banks are getting large donations of food from food companies. That's a lot. Food banks rely on donations They also raise funds and use funds to just operate and run their business, and also to purchase food, etc. But a large portion of the food you see at a food pantry, the food pantry gets all their food from the food banks. The food banks are the large warehouses, and they get very large donations of food from corporations and food companies, Kroger, all of them, Walmart.
Pepsi-Cola.
Yes, they all donate to food banks. MAZON, as Liz said, is a Jewish organization in that we really just rally the Jewish community in the country behind the issue of hunger. We raise a lot of most of our funds from all of our funds from the Jewish community, individual families, but we mostly don't have any large corporations donating to us.
So yeah, I feel like as neither of us are in our development department, I can't speak with this with firm authority, but certainly most of our donors are small donors. But it is an interesting kind of path to walk. I think there's work that we do that's, I would hope is attractive to the not Jewish community, to the secular community, and how to walk that line and how to make people comfortable with a very obviously Jewish organization, although a lot of people are confused about our name, so maybe they don't know it offhand, but maybe it doesn't kind of signal to everyone. But I think, and it's certainly in my part of the work, most of my engagement is with the Jewish community, but there's always a question of, what can we do on the city level? What can we do to engage other faith communities? And just because the Jewish values resonate doesn't mean they're just our values. And so I think there's always kind of bridging that we can do, and conversations to be had with donors and certainly like with elected officials, to kind of make that discussion. And why is there a Jewish organization in the room? And we walk in the door and they want to talk to us about Israel, whether or not that's why we're there to talk. And so it's always carrying that identity with us is kind of always part of the work.
Thank you for the clarification.
So Julia, you had a question as well.
We understood another issue that presents with regards to school kids is that while they may get school breakfasts and school lunches, they go home then on the weekend and often don't have food. And there were these backpack programs here in Los Angeles where you could adopt a school and then provide backpacks to each child who needed it, filled with loaves of bread and jars of peanut butter and enough food to just get them through the weekend. Is that something that you also promote? Because it is a really nice project and quite accessible for, say, sisterhoods and synagogues, and the relationship can become very personal if you adopt a school, for example.
That is a great idea. I recall when that backpack program began, it was at well over 10 years ago, long time ago. And someone who was on the hearing yesterday, was a woman, testified and said she launched the backpack program in their community, and that is still a robust program. But you're right, I don't hear about it as much these days. And because you really need to support that on your own. That is a program that is not supported with public funding. Like you said, that is something that the private sector, the community is contributing to that program and investing in that. But it is critical. I mean, children were sent home with very nutritious backpack of food. I mean, they would make sure that it was a nutritious load of food that would last not only the child, in many cases, the whole family. I mean, there was meals in there that would last days. So I think that's a very viable idea for a volunteer effort. I like that idea.
So certainly, it's again, being in relationship with folks in your community and seeing what the needs are. It's not something that, like, it's just not how MAZON does our work. Although interestingly, we were just going through some of our photos that we have. We had a photojournalist go around the country and interview people experiencing food insecurity. And so we have this incredible archive of moving photos, and we have tons of elementary school children and like with their backpacks and being so delighted with these backpacks and just their faces lighting up that they know they have a nutritious food for the weekend. And it feels like a celebration, even though it's was very, very sweet and hard. But so I think, pursuing those kinds of projects is of course wonderful and deeply moving and valuable. And I just want to invite you to kind of just take that step back and think about, it's like, why, like what's happening that these kids don't have these nutritious meals at home? What's happening that family is being supported by this food that is coming home for the child? And so that's telling us that SNAP dollars need to be increased. That's telling us that other benefit programs need to fully serve these families. And what can we do to address that? And so we did just see an increase in SNAP benefits that went from a $1.40 approximately per person per meal to $1.80, which is an increase, and that's great. It's clearly not enough. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And and so we kind of have to hold these things both at once, right? Because the work of advocacy is incredibly important and it's slow. And so we need to, see how we can kind of be of service in our communities and how we can address those larger problems. And I'm seeing we have something in the chat from Wendy. Oh, they're talking about the delays in the child tax credit.
Yes. I'm not that familiar with the advocacy taking place on that. Are you, Liz?
I'm not, and then that's, I feel like there's a whole other conversation we could have about, addressing wealth inequality generally. What are the drivers that got us here? We talk about MAZON about ending hunger and its causes. And we're really just delving into what that work looks like and where we can be effective. But there's, of course, a whole world of drivers to this. Marla was talking about populations that are disproportionately affected by hunger, whether it's, women-headed households or people of color. And one of the particular populations that we work with is military families, and what are the barriers to all these folks to getting their food security met? And it's a win for us when we can really identify what those kind of pinpoint policy solutions are. It's even greater win when we can make those policy solutions happen. And so for the work of a sisterhood, I think there's so much that we have to do to get people to understand how valuable policy is. It's, whether or not you're undertaking the work of policy, just knowing that, to go back to that stat, but 95% of the food assistance in this country is coming from programs like SNAP and the school lunch program and other commodities programs. That like if there's any decrease in those benefits, if there's frankly a change in administration that undercuts those policies, then that's a gap that the charitable food system cannot fill. That all of the work that we put into that, we cannot fill. And so we need to dearly protect these federal programs, and we need to do all of that deep community work to see what people need and when they need it and how to help their immediate needs.
Can you address what is going on right now with the social service agencies, which is, I mean, I realize it was worse during the very bad part of the pandemic, but they're being stretched right now. And I've heard of people going and needy families going there, and there just isn't anything, because when people hear about this, it's, well, try a social service agency. And I know families are trying to help each other and friends are trying to help each other. But I've heard that when people go to these social service agencies, they're basically turned away. When some of them go to food banks, there really is, the quality of food isn't, or food pantries, the quality of the food isn't the greatest unless you like something like eggplant. And also, with the backpack thing, and I hadn't heard of this, but with kids being kids, how can you even decide what to put in and to assure that they just won't like it and they'll just like throw half of it away?
Yes, that is an issue. I mean, we hear different stories that ever since the national, what was it called? The healthy, the school meal standards, when they were put in place and salad bars suddenly appeared at all the schools, that children were going down the line and dumping their lunches. I know there was a lot of education taking place. I've also heard that it's not always true, but you have to start somewhere. That's why I brought up the nutrition education at the pantries, because they're getting a lot of fresh produce. And whether it's a cauliflower or an eggplant or an artichoke, there might be foods that A, are not culturally appropriate, but B, that some folks have never even cooked with before. So there's a lot of work, even at the salad bars at the schools. I know that there were educators explaining to children, how to build their salad, why it's so important. And I hear mixed stories. I hear that children love the food at the schools and that some don't really like it. They prefer to have their, pizza and I don't even know, corn dogs or what they're serving there, frozen, some things that are rather unnutritious. But it is true. There's a learning curve and we have to start somewhere. I mean, we've all seen the industry change. Look at the plant-based foods, Impossible Burgers. I mean, I remember when our colleagues were advocating for menu labeling. I was at MAZON when the labels, the calories on the menus. I mean, all of these things started from ground zero and have made a lot of progress. And I think that's what we're battling right now. There is a movement, but it takes time. It does take time, and we have to start it to make that progress. So I think that's the stage that we're in right now. And with the schools as well. And trust me, it's at risk. Under the Trump administration, they want to roll back those nutrition standards. I don't know if many of you remember when, the ketchup was a vegetable and the tomato sauce on the pizza was that counted as the vegetable for the meal. They have to count how many vegetables in the day. And they went more lenient during COVID on those standards, and they're at risk right now of staying in place. So a lot of advocates are just fighting, please don't roll those back, because there was progress. It's slow, but there was progress. And they were seeing progress in the childhood obesity rates, which are huge, scary, really frightening for many reasons. Including as a defense issue. I mean, the military can't enroll enough young adults that are of a weight that, when they're obese, they can't get enrolled. So that we're hearing about it from all different kinds of angles how this plays out. So I obviously very passionate about it, but I agree. It is an issue, and we just need to stay on the course.
And I think, Wendy, too, just to the issue with social service agencies, and I can't speak to that because it's just not my part of the field, but I think like with so many issues, when we as communities are looking at like how do we start to work on this? I'm hearing like I want to donate to a social service agency, but I hear that they have no capacity, and I want to work to make SNAP better, but I hear that you go to to sign up for SNAP and it's impossible, and and it's so frustrating, and X, Y, and Z happens, and and it feels like there's barriers at every corner. And I'm not going to say there aren't barriers at every corner, but I think it's about discussing with your community, like what's resonant to you, and what part of this fight do you want to take on, and what bandwidth do you have, and where do you deploy it? And so if it's working with your local JFS and volunteering hours and making sure they have the funds to do their work, then like that's one way to do it. If it's saying like I want to step back and look at what are policy changes and know that it's the long game, but all of this is the long game. We are not solving hunger tomorrow, and so. And one of our, Lauren, who Marla has name checked a number of times, she told a lovely story about doing winter coat drives as a kid, and how she donated a coat every year. And at some point she got a few years older and she realized that she was still donating a coat every year. And and that I think that's part of kind of what inspired her to do the work that she does to make policy change, because she didn't want, she kind of saw in front of her a life of coat drives. But they're all so valid and so wonderful, like all these ways that we can engage. It's just finding your piece.
Any other questions? Well, we'd like to thank you all for coming, and also Liz Braun-Lilenfeld and Marla Feldman from MAZON. We hope that not only will your congregation be able to create a successful program to help fight hunger, but that you also will let us know about it. Please submit your programs to the Sisterhood Program Exchange so we can share them. Forms are in the program section on the PD page of WRJPD.org. Also, watch our page in the upcoming weeks for a toolkit on what your sisterhood can do to fight insecurity in your congregation and in your community. Please join us on the first Wednesday in February for a special women cantorial concert. Music of the Diaspora will feature music from around the Jewish world, hosted by cantor Janice Cohen of Kolami, Tucson. The February 2nd concert will be at 7 p.m. PST. Again, thank you for joining us. We wish you all a very happy, healthy, and prosperous 2022. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This was great. Thank you so much.
And email
Thank
me.
you.
I want to work with you.
Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.